My name is Cassidy. I am 33 years old and I recently bought a stunning new house. Technically, my parents bought it for me through a trust after watching me work to the bone for a decade as a wealth advisor. I invited my husband's family over for a simple housewarming dinner, expecting polite conversation and wine. Instead, my husband's mother Barbara toured my home, picked out her favorite bedroom, and demanded I hand over the keys and security codes right at the dinner table. When my husband backed her up and tried to claim the house was his to give away, I did not cry or throw a fit. I smiled, stood up, and delivered a financial reality check that made the blood drain from his mother's greedy face. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to entitled relatives who felt they owned everything you built. My parents taught me the value of hard work and ironclad financial planning. I applied those lessons rigorously, becoming a certified financial planner, advising very wealthy clients. My husband Nolan was a regional sales director. When we met, he was charming and seemed to share my ambitions. But over our 5 years of marriage, his true colors emerged. He was deeply entitled, constantly spending beyond our means to impress his image-obsessed mother Barbara and his spineless father Gregory. Nolan's sister Vanessa was a woman drowning in secret debt to maintain a facade of luxury. The only sensible person in their family was Vanessa's husband Terrence. Terrence is an African-American certified public accountant who worked tirelessly. He and I shared knowing glances at family gatherings, quietly acknowledging the financial insanity around us. The defining moment of our marriage happened on a crisp Friday evening in late October. We were hosting my husband's family for the very first time at my new house. It is a gorgeous modern colonial property in one of the exclusive suburbs of Boston, valued at over $1 million. I spent months searching for the perfect home, and my parents, wanting to reward my relentless hard work, purchased it for me in cash. They were incredibly smart about it, utilizing a revocable living trust to ensure the asset was protected. The deed belonged to the trust, not to me directly, and certainly not to Nolan. I had prepared a beautiful dinner. We were sitting around the custom oak dining table, enjoying roast tenderloin and expensive wine. Barbara was wearing an absurd amount of jewelry, her diamond bracelets clinking against the fine china every time she reached for her glass. She spent the entire evening evaluating the crown molding, pacing through the guest rooms, and making rude comments about how the kitchen island was too small for her taste. Nolan suddenly stood up and tapped his knife against his crystal wine glass, demanding the room's attention. He smiled broadly, puffing out his chest as if he were the lord of the manor. I assumed he was going to offer a toast to my parents for their generosity. I was completely wrong. "I want to thank everyone for coming to celebrate our new home," Nolan announced, his voice booming with unearned pride. "We have so much space now, and I figured out the perfect arrangement for all of us. The master suite is for me and Cassidy. The massive second-floor suite with the private balcony is going to be for Mom and Dad. Vanessa and Terrence, you guys can take the finished basement suite. It has its own entrance, so you will have plenty of privacy." I froze, my fork hovering halfway to my mouth. I glanced at Terrence, who looked bewildered by this sudden housing assignment. Vanessa, however, clapped her hands together in delight, already calculating how much rent money she could save to spend on designer handbags. Before I could process the absolute audacity of his speech, Barbara leaned across the table. Her diamond bracelets clattered loudly against the polished wood. She looked at me with a sweet smile that did not reach her eyes. "Cassidy, darling, you need to hand over 2 sets of keys and the garage passcode before we leave tonight," Barbara said, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. "My movers are booked for Monday morning. I need to make sure the cleaning crew gets in early so the suite is spotless before my furniture arrives." The sheer entitlement suffocated the air in the room. They had entirely bypassed asking me, the actual owner of the property, and simply declared that my home was now their personal family compound. Nolan sat back down, looking pleased with himself, waiting for me to comply and hand over the keys like a subservient wife. I slowly set my wine glass down on the coaster. I did not reach into my purse. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of the rage boiling inside my chest. I looked directly into Barbara's demanding eyes, letting a calm, polite smile spread across my face. "Why would you need keys to a house you aren't moving into?" I asked, my voice cutting through the dining room with absolute clarity. The self-satisfied smirk melted off Nolan's face. Barbara's jaw dropped, her hands freezing on the table. Gregory stared at his plate, avoiding the conflict. Only Terrence seemed to understand the gravity of the shift in the room, his eyes darting between me and Nolan. "What do you mean, Cassidy?" Barbara sputtered, her voice rising an octave. "Nolan just said we are taking the upstairs suite." "Nolan was mistaken," I replied smoothly, keeping my posture relaxed and my gaze unwavering. "This is a private residence and there are no guest rooms available for long-term living. You will need to cancel your movers on Monday, Barbara. Nobody is moving into this house except me." The heavy silence that followed my firm declaration was absolutely deafening. For 3 agonizingly long seconds, nobody at the table even moved a muscle. Then Barbara let out a loud, dramatic gasp that echoed loudly through the modern dining room. Her trembling hand flew to her chest, her fingers curling tightly around her expensive pearl necklace. She pushed her heavy oak chair back, the thick wooden legs scraping harshly against the imported rug. "How dare you!" she cried out, her shrill voice trembling with completely manufactured agony. "How dare you invite us here tonight just to humiliate us like this? You are intentionally tearing this entire innocent family apart right now, Cassidy. You are viciously tearing us to pieces out of pure, unadulterated selfishness." Gregory predictably patted her arm, murmuring useless words of comfort. Vanessa slammed her hands flat on the table, glaring at me. "You cannot be serious right now," Vanessa snapped. "I already gave up my lease. Terrence and I need that basement suite. You have all this space and you are just going to hoard it." I kept my posture perfectly straight, my hands resting in my lap. I did not raise my voice. I simply watched them perform their coordinated tantrum because they were denied unrestricted access to property they did not purchase. Then the real explosion happened. Nolan slammed his fists down on the dining table, making the crystal wine glasses jump and slosh burgundy liquid onto the white tablecloth. The sudden noise silenced his mother and sister instantly. He pushed himself up from his chair, his face flushed red. He leaned heavily over the table, glaring down at me with absolute disgust. "You listen to me," Nolan snarled, pointing a finger at my face. "You seem to have forgotten exactly where you came from. You were nothing before I found you. My mother paid for your groceries when you were a broke college student. I carried you financially for years while you figured out your little career. You owe this family everything." I stared at my husband, feeling a cold, clinical detachment settle over my mind as I absorbed the sheer fiction he was spewing. He carried me financially. The audacity was breathtaking. I did not speak, but my mind instantly flashed back to those years. I remembered working opening shifts at a coffee shop, attending classes, and then closing at an accounting firm. I remembered living on cheap noodles, so I could meticulously allocate every spare dollar to pay off his $60,000 in student loan debt. I remembered him spending his salary on happy hours and designer suits, while I quietly built the foundation of our financial lives. He had never carried me. I dragged him across the finish line of adulthood, but I did not scream any of this at him. A wealth advisor knows better than to show their hand during negotiations. Let the opposing party expose their ignorance. When I did not cower, Nolan's anger shifted into something darker. He walked slowly around the large oak table until he was standing directly beside my chair. He leaned down, placing his hands on the armrests, trapping me in my seat. I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath. He dropped his voice to a low, threatening whisper, carrying clearly in the silent room. "You are playing a very dangerous game right now, Cassidy," he murmured. "You think because your parents set up some fancy trust, you hold all the cards. But you are wrong. Under state law, this house is marital property. We are married. What is yours is mine. If you do not hand those keys to my mother right now and apologize for your behavior, I will take half of everything you own. Do not make me bring in my lawyers. I will ruin you." I looked him dead in the eyes. He expected fear and submission. I offered neither. I simply turned my head away and looked across the table. My gaze landed directly on Terrence. Throughout this entire ordeal, Vanessa's husband had not spoken a single word. Terrence was a certified public accountant. He was a man who lived by logic and hard facts. He knew the reality of financial struggle, having worked his way up from nothing to build a respectable career. Terrence was not looking at his crying mother-in-law or his fuming wife. Terrence was staring intently at Nolan's left wrist, which was currently resting on the edge of my chair. Gleaming under the chandelier was Nolan's brand-new watch. It was a heavy custom gold Rolex. I knew the exact model. It retailed for $15,000. Nolan had come home with it 2 weeks ago, claiming he won it in a regional sales competition. I watched Terrence's eyes narrow as he analyzed the watch. The math in Terrence's head was working in overdrive. Nolan's base salary and commission structure were public knowledge. Terrence knew exactly how much Nolan brought home after taxes. He also knew the suffocating cost of the lifestyle Nolan and Vanessa insisted on maintaining. Sales competitions did not hand out $15,000 custom Rolexes, especially not in a down market. Terrence shifted uncomfortably in his seat, slowly adjusting his tight collar. He looked up and his dark eyes locked squarely with mine. In that brief, silent second, an entire conversation passed between us without a single spoken word. The hesitation in his posture completely vanished. I caught the subtle, almost imperceptible shake of his head. He knew the watch was not a prize. He knew the money to buy it had to come from somewhere else entirely. Terrence was sitting on a massive financial secret, one that could destroy everything they had built. Looking at the arrogant, threatening man standing over me, I knew exactly what Terrence had decided in his heart. He was no longer on Nolan's side, and he was finally ready to help me burn this family's facade to the ground. The morning sun streamed through the expansive bay windows of my new home, illuminating the polished hardwood floors I had spent months meticulously selecting. The house was dead quiet. Nolan had already gone for his morning run, leaving behind the stale tension of last night's disastrous dinner. I brewed a pot of dark roast coffee, intentionally ignoring the phantom echoes of Barbara loudly demanding the keys to my sanctuary. As a certified financial planner, I lived by a strict morning routine. Today was property tax day. My parents had purchased the physical house through the trust, but I was responsible for the annual property taxes and general upkeep. I carried my coffee to the kitchen island, opened my laptop, and navigated directly to the banking portal. I typed in my credentials, expecting to see the comforting balance of $260,000 sitting safely in the joint high-yield savings account Nolan and I shared for major household expenses. The page loaded. I blinked, the bright screen burning my eyes. The balance read $10,400. My breath caught in my throat. I refreshed the browser, assuming it was a glitch in the bank's interface. The number remained exactly the same. $10,400. $250,000 had completely vanished overnight. I am a wealth advisor. I manage millions of dollars for high net worth clients every single day. I do not misplace $250,000. I clicked on the transaction history, my fingers flying frantically across the trackpad. There it was. A wire transfer initiated 3 days ago, authorized exclusively by Nolan's login credentials. The destination account was intentionally obfuscated, masked behind a routing number I did not immediately recognize. It was not a routine transfer to one of our brokerage accounts. It was an outbound wire to an external, unverified financial institution. A cold, suffocating dread pooled deep in my stomach, quickly replaced by a razor-sharp surge of adrenaline. Nolan had deliberately drained our liquidity just days before demanding I hand over the keys to his mother. The front door opened and closed. Nolan jogged into the kitchen, his designer athletic wear barely showing a sweat. He headed straight for the refrigerator, grabbing a bottle of imported water. "Good morning, babe," he said, flashing that effortless, charming smile he always used to close tough sales deals. Have you thought about which keys you are giving my mother? I turned the laptop screen toward him. The harsh glare of the banking portal reflected brightly in his eyes. Where is our money, Nolan? I asked, my voice dangerously flat. He casually glanced at the screen, took a long swig of water, and sighed loudly, shaking his head as if dealing with an unruly toddler. Relax, Cassidy. I moved it yesterday. I was going to tell you over dinner, but you decided to make a massive scene in front of my parents. I stood up from the bar stool, planting my hands firmly on the marble counter. You wired $250,000 out of our joint account without consulting me. Where did it go? Nolan tossed the water bottle into the recycling bin and leaned against the counter, crossing his arms defensively. I moved it to a higher-yielding investment portfolio for our future, he said smoothly. The interest rate on that savings account was barely beating inflation. My guy at the firm tipped me off to a private equity fund that is generating massive returns. It is a locked 12-month hold, but the payout will be absolutely incredible. I stared at him, dissecting the absolute garbage spilling from his lying mouth. Private equity funds require accredited investor verification, extensive subscription agreements, and joint signatures if the seed capital originates from a marital account. I had signed nothing. I had seen no prospectus. You are lying, I said. You do not have a private equity guy. I handle our investments. Show me the subscription agreement right now. Nolan's charming smile hardened into a vicious, ugly sneer. He stepped closer, towering over me aggressively, attempting to use his physical size to force my submission. Why are you always so hysterical? He demanded, his voice rising sharply in the quiet kitchen. This is exactly why I did not tell you beforehand. You always have to control every single penny. You micromanage my entire life. I am your husband. I am the head of this household. Do you not trust me? It is our money. Cassidy and I am putting it to work for us so we can actually afford the taxes on this massive house you just had to have. The gaslighting was so textbook it was almost insulting. He was taking my money, hiding it, and making me the villain for noticing the theft. I did not raise my voice. I did not shrink back. I need to see the wire confirmation and the destination account details before I leave for my office today, I stated firmly. Nolan grabbed his gym towel and threw it forcefully on the counter. You are unbelievable, he scoffed, turning his back and heading toward the stairs. I will email you the prospectus when I get to the office. Stop acting like a paranoid lunatic and trust your husband for once in your life. I listened to his heavy footsteps rapidly ascending the stairs. The moment the bedroom door clicked shut, I grabbed my phone. Nolan was not smart enough to execute a sophisticated financial maneuver, hiding $250,000 without leaving a massive paper trail. But he was arrogant enough to think he could outsmart me. I paced the length of my living room, my mind racing furiously. Private equity was a blatant lie. If he took that money, he spent it or gave it away to someone else. The image of last night's dinner flashed vividly in my mind. Nolan's new custom gold Rolex gleaming brightly under the dining room lights, Barbara's smug demand for the keys to my house, and Terrence, the quiet, certified public accountant who had stared at that Rolex with narrow, fiercely calculating eyes. Terrence, who did the taxes for Nolan's entire greedy family. I unlocked my phone and dialed Terrence's private office number. He answered on the second ring. Terrence speaking. Terrence, I said, keeping my voice low and desperate. As a CPA, I need you to tell me the absolute truth right now. Where did Nolan move $250,000 of our money? A heavy, exhausted silence hung heavily on the line. I could hear the sound of a thick metal file cabinet drawer slamming shut in the background. Terrence let out a long, ragged sigh that carried the immense weight of a man who was entirely sick of covering up other people's toxic messes. Meet me at my office in exactly 1 hour, Terrence said, his voice completely stripped of all family pleasantries. And Cassidy, bring a secure encrypted flash drive. I parked my car 2 blocks away from Terrence's accounting firm, making sure to pay the meter in cash, so the transaction would not appear on any digital statement Nolan could access. Terrence ran a highly successful boutique CPA firm right in the heart of the financial district. When I walked into his corner office, the heavy blinds were already drawn tight against the morning sun. He sat behind his massive glass desk, his usually immaculate suit jacket discarded on a nearby chair, his tie loosened and pulled askew. He looked like a man who had not slept in days. I placed the encrypted flash drive on the glass surface between us. We did not bother with pleasantries. Terrence plugged the drive into a standalone laptop that was intentionally disconnected from his firm's main server network. "I told you the balance this morning was exactly $10,400, I said, keeping my voice perfectly steady. Nolan claimed he moved the rest to a high-yield private equity fund. He refused to show me the prospectus or the subscription agreement. Terrence let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "There is no private equity fund, Cassidy. Nolan does not even have a standard brokerage account outside of his employer-sponsored retirement plan." He typed a complex string of passwords into his forensic accounting software. "As the family CPA, I have full access to Gregory and Barbara's tax portals, and by extension I can see the breadcrumbs of Nolan's recent banking activities." He hit the enter key hard. "Look at this." He turned the monitor toward me. The screen displayed a harsh, undeniable reality. It was a digital wire trace document. Nolan had not invested our money. He had liquidated the account and executed two massive transfers. The first was a wire for $210,000 to an external holding company. "What is that account?" I asked, tracing the routing number on the screen with my finger. "That is a debt collection subsidiary for a string of luxury offshore casinos," Terrence said, his voice thick with absolute disgust. "Barbara has been hemorrhaging money for years. She maxed out Gregory's pension, took out a second mortgage on their house, and burned through $250,000 in secret high-interest credit lines. The creditors were threatening to put a lien on their property by the end of the month. Your husband stole your joint savings to bail his mother out of a massive gambling debt so she could keep playing rich at the country club." I stared at the screen, the absolute audacity of the theft settling deep into my bones. Nolan had looked me dead in the eye last night and demanded I hand over the keys to a house my parents bought right after he used my hard-earned money to save his mother from financial ruin. And the remaining $40,000, I asked, my voice dangerously calm. Terrence clicked to the next transaction record, a direct wire to Cartier. He bought Vanessa a diamond necklace for her 30th birthday last week. Terrence stood up and began pacing the length of his office. His hands were clenched into tight fists at his sides. "Do you want to know the sickest part of all this?" he asked, stopping to look directly at me. "Vanessa wore that exact necklace to dinner last night. When she opened the box last week, she looked me straight in the face and told me it was a high-quality fake she bought off a replica website for $200. She swore Nolan just put it in a real Cartier box as a joke to make her feel special." I watched the realization completely wash over Terrence. He was a brilliant, meticulous man who built his entire life on financial honesty. He had worked his way through college, built his own firm, and provided Vanessa with a beautiful life. And she was treating him like an absolute fool. "It gets worse," Terrence said, walking back to his desk and pulling a thick manila folder from his locked bottom drawer. He tossed it onto the glass desk with a heavy thud. "I am currently facing a full IRS audit. I received the official notice 3 days ago. Vanessa has been opening secret credit cards using my social security number. She maxed out nearly $80,000 in luxury purchases, defaulted on the payments, and hid the collection notices from the mail. Because my name is fraudulently attached to the accounts, the IRS flagged the massive discrepancies in our joint tax filings. My own wife is destroying my professional CPA license and my credit score to buy designer bags to impress her mother's friends." We stood there in the quiet office, two successful professionals who had been completely bled dry by a family of financial parasites. Nolan and Vanessa had grown up entitled, taught by Barbara that appearances mattered significantly more than integrity. They saw us not as equal partners, but as walking bank accounts. We were blindly funding their delusions of grandeur. "I am not letting him get away with this," I said, my voice hardening into steel. "I am going to report the wire transfer as federal wire fraud. I will pull the security footage from the bank branch if I have to." Terrence reached across the desk and offered his hand. I looked at it, then up at his face. The exhaustion in his eyes had been completely replaced by a cold, calculating determination. "We are going to do much more than report a wire transfer, Cassidy. We are going to burn their entire fake empire to the ground. I have all of Barbara's tax returns. I have Vanessa's hidden credit statements. I have the paper trail for every single dollar Nolan stole from you. We are going to strip them of every asset, every ounce of their fake social status, and we are going to do it completely by the book." I firmly gripped his hand and shook it. The alliance was permanently forged. There would be no screaming matches, no tearful interventions. We were going to dismantle their lives with surgical precision. Terrence released my hand and sat back down at his computer. "But before we drop the hammer, you need to survive tonight." He quickly navigated to the county clerk's digital public records portal. He pulled up a pending applications queue and highlighted a specific row on the screen. "Nolan did not just steal your money," Terrence said, pointing directly at the pending document. "He filed an expedited application for a quitclaim deed transfer early this morning. He paid the premium processing fee to have the paperwork fast-tracked through the county office. He is coming home tonight, and he is going to try to force you to sign half of your new house over to him." I stared at the pending real estate document, the final piece of Nolan's pathetic puzzle clicking perfectly into place. He thought he could drain my cash, bully me into submission, and legally steal my home in a single 24-hour window. I smiled a genuine, terrifying smile. Let him try. The drive back from the financial district to our pristine suburban neighborhood felt like gliding through a completely different dimension. Knowing your husband is a thief is one thing, but knowing exactly how, when, and why he committed the theft gives you an intoxicating level of control. I did not rush. I let the heater warm the chilled leather of my car seats, listening to the rhythmic hum of the tires against the pavement. Terrence had handed me the ultimate playbook. I knew Nolan's every move before he even made it. By the time I pulled into the wide paved driveway of my $1 million home, my heart rate was perfectly steady. The house was blazing with light, a sharp contrast to the cold October evening outside. I took a deep, cleansing breath, smoothing the lapels of my tailored coat. It was time to give my husband the performance of a lifetime. I unlocked the heavy front door and stepped into the grand foyer. The scent of expensive citrus candles filled the air, replacing the stale tension from the morning. Classical music played softly from the hidden surround sound speakers. I slipped off my heels and walked toward the kitchen. Nolan was standing by the marble island, completely transformed. Gone was the aggressive, defensive man who had practically yelled at me over his missing $250,000. Instead, he wore a crisp, casual button-down shirt, his hair perfectly styled. Resting on the counter was a chilled bottle of imported champagne, 2 crystal flutes, and a thick stack of stapled legal documents. He looked up, flashing that practiced, brilliant smile that had completely fooled me 5 years ago. He stepped forward, reaching out to gently massage my shoulders. "Hey, babe," Nolan murmured, his voice dripping with manufactured warmth and contrition. "I am so glad you are finally home. Listen, I want to apologize for this morning. I was stressed about the market and I completely took it out on you. You deserve better than that." I forced my facial muscles to relax, letting a look of mild surprise and relief wash over my features. I looked from his smiling face down to the chilled bottle of champagne. "What is all this, Nolan?" I asked, keeping my tone carefully neutral. He poured the bubbling golden liquid into the 2 flutes, handing one to me with an affectionate wink. "It is a peace offering," he said smoothly. "I have been thinking about last night, and you were right. My parents overstepped. It is your house, your sanctuary. I called my mother this afternoon and told her she needs to cancel the movers. They are not moving into our space. I will not let them disrespect you like that again." I took a slow sip of the champagne, watching him over the rim of the crystal glass. The lie was so smooth, so effortlessly delivered, that it was genuinely terrifying. If I had not spent the afternoon in Terrence's secure office looking at the digital wire traces paying off Barbara's gambling debts, I might have actually believed him. "Thank you," I replied softly. "I appreciate you taking my side." Nolan's smile widened, his eyes practically gleaming with triumphant satisfaction. He thought he had completely disarmed me. He set his glass down and casually patted the stack of papers resting on the marble. "We are a team, Cassidy. Always." Speaking of which, my accountant called me today about the property taxes. He said that because the house is held in that trust your parents set up, we are going to get absolutely hammered on the capital gains and marital tax exemptions unless we make a quick administrative adjustment. I stepped closer to the island, looking down at the papers. "And what kind of adjustment is that?" I asked, playing the role of the compliant, relieved wife. Nolan chuckled, waving his hand as if the details were incredibly boring and insignificant. "Oh, it is just standard bureaucratic red tape. We just need to add my name to the deed for tax exemption purposes. It proves to the state that it is our primary marital residence, which shields us from the luxury property surcharges. Just sign right here on the last page, and I will have my assistant file it with the county clerk first thing tomorrow morning. Then we never have to talk about my parents or property taxes ever again." He clicked a heavy silver fountain pen and held it out to me, his eyes wide and trusting. I looked down at the document. He had folded the top pages back, trying to obscure the bold capitalized heading, but I did not need to see the title to know exactly what it was. It was a quitclaim deed. By signing that single piece of paper, I would instantly surrender 50% of my physical equity in the property directly to him, completely bypassing the ironclad protections of my parents' revocable living trust. It was the ultimate financial coup. He wanted to drain my cash and steal half my house in the exact same week. I did not scream. I did not throw the champagne in his face. I simply smiled, a soft, yielding smile that made Nolan let out a quiet, barely audible breath of relief. I took the silver pen from his hand. "You are right, Nolan," I whispered, leaning over the marble island. "We are a team." I pressed the heavy pen to the thick paper and smoothly signed. Nolan did not even wait for the ink to dry. He practically snatched the document right out from under my hand. His eyes were wide with victorious glee. He had beaten me. What Nolan completely failed to realize was that I had intentionally signed with a deliberate, legally invalid signature. Instead of my own legal name, I wrote the name of his secret offshore casino. Let him explain that absolute forgery to the county clerk tomorrow morning when he files it. The morning sun felt remarkably warm against my skin as I walked out of my front door. Nolan was sitting at the kitchen island, happily scrolling through his phone and drinking his protein shake. He had an infuriatingly arrogant smirk plastered across his face. He truly believed he had outsmarted me. He believed that piece of paper with a fake casino name scrawled on the signature line was his golden ticket to owning half of my $1 million estate. I did not ruin his delusion. I simply grabbed my leather briefcase, offered him a polite wave, and drove straight into downtown Boston. My destination was the law firm of Sterling and Hayes. Arthur Sterling was my parents' estate attorney, a brilliant, ruthless legal mind who had spent 40 years protecting high-net-worth families from exactly this kind of predatory behavior. I had called him on my drive-in, giving him a brief overview of the disaster unfolding in my marriage. By the time I was sitting across from him in his expansive corner office, he already had my trust documents pulled up on his computer monitor. "Arthur," I said, taking a sip of the sparkling water his assistant had provided. "Last night, Nolan tried to force me to sign a quitclaim deed. He expedited the filing process. He wants to surrender 50% of the equity into his name to bypass the trust entirely. I signed it with a fake name, but I need to know our exposure." Arthur leaned back in his leather chair and let out a deep, booming laugh. It was a rich, genuine sound of pure amusement. He took off his reading glasses and wiped a tear of mirth from his eye. "Cassidy," he chuckled, shaking his head slowly, "your husband could have forced you to sign that document in your own blood with a notary present while swearing an oath on a stack of Bibles. It would not make a single shred of difference. That piece of paper is completely legally void." I sat forward, feeling the tension in my shoulders begin to melt away. "Explain it to me," I said. Arthur tapped his manicured finger against his mahogany desk. "Nolan is operating under the assumption that this house is marital property simply because you reside in it together. He is trying to use a standard real estate maneuver. A quitclaim deed transfers whatever interest the grantor has in a property to the grantee. But here is the beautiful reality of an American revocable living trust. You are not the legal owner of that house. You do not hold the title. He turned his monitor so I could see the official deed records. The property is owned exclusively by the Wilson Family Revocable Living Trust, he explained smoothly. You are the beneficiary, yes, but your parents are the primary trustees. In the eyes of the law, the trust is a separate, impenetrable financial entity. You individually do not possess the legal authority to transfer, sell, or divide the title. Even a perfectly signed legitimate quitclaim deed executed by you is absolutely worthless because you cannot give away something you do not legally own. A wave of sheer relief washed over me. My parents had been so incredibly smart. They had anticipated that my marriage might eventually sour, and they built a fortress around my assets. If Nolan actually marches into the county clerk's office and tries to file that fraudulent paperwork, the clerk will reject it immediately. Arthur continued, a sharp, predatory smile forming on his face. The title search will instantly flag that the grantor does not match the legal owner on record. Best case scenario for him, he gets laughed out of the building. Worst case scenario, if he pushes the issue, he commits documented fraud by attempting to alter a deed he has absolutely no legal rights to touch. I let out a long breath, a genuine smile spreading across my face. He thought he cornered me, I said quietly. He drained my joint savings account to pay off his mother's secret gambling debts, and then he thought he could steal half my house to replenish his own pockets. Arthur's expression instantly sobered. He reached for a thick manila folder resting on the corner of his desk. When you called me this morning and mentioned the missing $250,000, I took the liberty of pulling a comprehensive financial background check on your husband. Since we are moving toward a high-stakes divorce involving massive financial fraud, I needed to see his complete footprint. I cross-referenced public loan registries and credit inquiries tied directly to his Social Security number. Arthur opened the folder and slid a printed financial report across the polished wood toward me. I scanned the pages, my eyes landing on a freshly highlighted section. I frowned, trying to make sense of the numbers. Nolan did not have significant assets in his own name. He had credit cards, a car lease, and his remaining student loans. Look at the date on that last inquiry, Arthur instructed, pointing to a line item near the bottom of the page. I traced the date. It was exactly 1 week ago, just days before the disastrous housewarming dinner. The line item indicated a massive loan origination. Did you know your husband took out a $100,000 line of credit against his parents' home last week? Arthur asked, his voice dropping into a deadly serious register. I froze, the blood running cold in my veins. I read the document again. It was a home equity line of credit, commonly known as a HELOC. The collateral for the loan was Gregory and Barbara's primary residence, but the primary borrower listed on the origination document was Nolan. He leveraged his own parents' house. I whispered, the sheer depravity of the situation hitting me all at once. Arthur nodded. He manipulated them perfectly. Nolan is dangerously toxic and we will win. I stared at the origination document resting on Arthur's polished mahogany desk. The sheer gravity of Nolan's financial treachery hit me like a physical blow. He had not just stolen my hard-earned savings to pay off his mother's gambling debts. He had actively leveraged his own parents' primary residence, taking out a $100,000 line of credit behind their backs. The sheer audacity of the maneuver was chilling. Arthur watched me absorb the information, his hands steepled under his chin, his expression grave. Nolan was acting as Barbara's financial proxy, using her desperate situation to gain access to their home equity. He was effectively robbing Peter to pay Paul and using my joint account as the ultimate slush fund. I thanked Arthur for his meticulous work, gathered my copies of the unassailable trust documents, and walked out of the law firm feeling completely untouchable. Nolan thought he was a criminal mastermind, but he was nothing more than a sloppy, desperate thief leaving a blazing paper trail directly to his own demise. I drove back to my office and spent the remainder of the afternoon systematically transferring my personal capital into locked individual accounts, completely severing any remaining financial ties Nolan could theoretically reach. The process was tedious, but deeply satisfying. Every dollar I secured was another nail in his eventual coffin. That evening, I was sitting in my living room enjoying a quiet glass of Cabernet. The house was blissfully silent. Nolan was out at a supposed client dinner, though given his recent behavior, I highly doubted clients were actually involved. I relished the solitude, letting the rich red wine soothe my frayed nerves. I watched the golden sunset slowly fade through the large bay windows, painting the suburban skyline in brilliant hues of orange and deep purple. I felt an unexpected wave of profound peace wash over me. The storm was coming, but I had built an impenetrable fortress. Suddenly, the serene silence was shattered. My phone buzzed violently on the glass coffee table, vibrating with aggressive insistence. It was a notification from the Blackwood family group chat. I unlocked the screen, watching the text bubbles rapidly populate the display. It was Barbara. "Good news," she typed, followed by 3 celebratory emojis. "I hired contractors. They are coming Friday at 8 in the morning to knock down the wall in Cassidy's home office to build my walk-in closet. Nolan said the house is officially half his now, so we are moving forward." My jaw practically unhinged. The sheer, unadulterated entitlement radiating from her text message was absolutely staggering. Nolan had actually gone back to his mother, handed her the forged, legally void quitclaim deed, and told her she had free rein to demolish my property. He had confidently assured her that he successfully bullied me into surrendering 50% of my $1 million estate. Barbara was not just planning to move her belongings in. She was actively initiating unauthorized structural demolition on a property she did not own, paid for by a trust she had no legal access to. Gregory chimed into the chat immediately after her message. "So proud of my son for securing his financial future," he typed. Vanessa added a long string of clapping icons, completely ignoring the fact that her husband Terrence and I were actively building a federal fraud case against her and her brother. They were all celebrating a victory that existed purely within their own delusional minds. They had convinced themselves that I was completely defeated. I sat back against the plush sofa cushions, staring at the glowing screen. A lesser woman would have immediately called Nolan, screaming and demanding an explanation. A weaker woman would have panicked, crying to her parents about the impending destruction of her home office. I did neither of those things. As a wealth advisor, I deal with hostile corporate takeovers and aggressive asset acquisitions regularly. You never interrupt your opponent when they are making a fatal, documented mistake. You simply step aside and let them run at full speed, right off the edge of the cliff. I placed my wine glass carefully on the coaster. I opened the group chat keyboard. I did not express anger. I did not threaten legal action or remind them that the house belonged exclusively to my parents' trust. I carefully crafted my response, ensuring it conveyed nothing but calm acceptance. I simply typed a single cheerful sentence. "Cannot wait to see the new layout." I hit send and watched the small read receipts instantly populate. Barbara replied with a smiling face, completely oblivious to the trap she had just willingly stepped into. Nolan remained dead silent in the chat, likely patting himself on the back for successfully putting his difficult wife in her place. He probably thought I had finally surrendered to his dominance. The moment I closed the messaging application, I opened my phone dialer. I did not call my husband. I called the local police precinct and asked to speak directly to the desk sergeant regarding an impending scheduled trespassing and unauthorized property destruction incident at my primary residence. I calmly provided the officer with Barbara's name, the contractor details, and the precise timeline of the planned demolition. After securing a documented police presence for Friday morning, I made a second call. I contacted a premium private security firm that specialized in asset protection for high-net-worth clients. I hired 2 armed security guards to be stationed inside my home office by 7 in the morning. I wanted absolute certainty that the perimeter would be locked down the moment the contractors arrived. If Barbara wanted a demolition, she was going to get a legal one. She was going to walk right into a heavily guarded, heavily documented criminal trap. There would be absolutely no mercy, no hesitation, and certainly no forgiveness from me. I was going to stand there perfectly composed and utterly victorious and watch her entire world crumble into dust. Terrence was a master of his craft. As a forensic accountant, he knew exactly how to dismantle a financial portfolio, but as a seasoned CPA, he also knew exactly how to create a highly convincing illusion. We needed Barbara to fully commit to her impending destruction. We needed her to burn her own bridges before she even realized the match was lit. Terrence spent 3 hours drafting a meticulously fabricated tax projection document. It was a masterpiece of bureaucratic deception. It featured official-looking letterheads, complex deduction tables, and a highly specific executive summary detailing a massive, time-sensitive financial loophole. He printed the document on premium paper and placed it casually on his glass dining room table, positioned perfectly next to Vanessa's favorite morning coffee mug. The trap was definitively set. Vanessa operated entirely on greed and entitlement. When she woke up the next morning, she immediately gravitated toward the kitchen. She poured her coffee and spotted the thick financial portfolio sitting in plain sight. Terrence had strategically left the document open to the final summary page. The bold, highlighted text was impossible to ignore. Vanessa leaned over the table, her eyes scanning the fabricated legal jargon. The document outlined a supposed federal capital gains exemption specifically tailored for senior citizens liquidating their primary assets. The fabricated projection explicitly stated that if Gregory and Barbara sold their current residence before the end of the week and immediately transferred their primary legal address to my newly purchased estate, they would qualify for an emergency marital tax shelter. The phantom loophole promised to shield exactly $150,000 from federal capital gains taxes. It was the ultimate financial fantasy engineered specifically for a family of financial parasites. Vanessa did not pause to question the legitimacy of the document. She did not ask her brilliant CPA husband to explain the intricate details of the tax code. Her eyes simply locked onto that massive six-figure number, and her greed instantly overrode whatever minimal common sense she possessed. She practically sprinted into the living room, grabbing her phone with trembling hands. She bypassed text messages entirely and dialed her mother directly. Barbara answered on the second ring. Vanessa did not bother with pleasantries. She read the fabricated executive summary verbatim, her voice pitching upward with manic excitement. She told Barbara that Terrence had discovered a secret tax loophole that would save them a fortune, but the deadline was absolute. They had to sell their house and formally change their legal address to my property by Friday morning. Barbara was a woman drowning in a vast ocean of hidden debt. She had maxed out secret credit cards, drained her husband's pension, and was actively hiding a $100,000 home equity line of credit that Nolan had fraudulently extracted on her behalf. She was suffocating under the weight of her own financial ruin, desperately treading water to maintain her wealthy country club facade. When Vanessa delivered the news of a $150,000 tax windfall, Barbara did not view it as a mere financial opportunity. She viewed it as absolute salvation. This fake money would erase her debts, silence the collection agencies, and allow her to continue living her lavish, delusional lifestyle indefinitely. She did not hesitate. The prospect of losing out on that massive payout terrified her more than anything else. Barbara immediately went to work. She knew that listing a house on the traditional real estate market took weeks, sometimes months, to secure a qualified buyer and finalize a mortgage closure. She did not have months. According to Terrence's fabricated document, she had less than 4 days. She bypassed the standard real estate agents entirely. Instead, she contacted a predatory high-volume corporate holding company that specialized in aggressive cash for homes transactions. These corporate buyers were notorious for targeting desperate sellers offering absolute liquidity within 24 hours, in exchange for significantly reduced property valuations. Barbara invited the corporate acquisitions manager to her home that very afternoon. She did not consult Gregory. She did not negotiate the terms. She simply demanded the fastest closure timeline legally possible in the state. The corporate manager inspected the property and immediately recognized her blind desperation. He slid a single piece of paper across her dining room table. It was an all-cash offer for exactly 40% below the actual market value of the home. It was an absolute insult, a low-ball figure designed to exploit sellers facing imminent foreclosure or bankruptcy. It would leave Gregory and Barbara with almost nothing after the remaining mortgage, and the massive home equity line of credit were automatically paid off during the escrow process. But Barbara could not see past her own greed. She was completely blinded by the phantom $150,000 tax loophole waiting for her at my house. She firmly believed she was outsmarting the system, trading a reduced sale price for a massive untaxed windfall. She reached across the table and firmly gripped the pen. She signed the binding purchase agreement with a triumphant flourish, legally committing to completely vacate the premises by Thursday evening. The ruthlessly efficient corporate buyer smiled widely, took the freshly signed contract, and walked right out the front door without looking back. Barbara had just sold out her trusting husband and willingly handed over her most valuable financial asset to a cold, faceless corporation. She sat there feeling incredibly victorious and brilliant, completely oblivious to the impending reality of her catastrophic choices. She had absolutely no idea that she was blindly signing away her only remaining shelter for mere pennies on the dollar. By aggressively chasing a fabricated tax loophole, expertly engineered by her brilliant son-in-law Barbara, had intentionally rendered herself completely legally homeless. She was now entirely dependent on moving her vast collection of highly prized luxury belongings into a heavily guarded private house that she would definitively never ever be legally allowed to enter. Nolan chose a pretentious, dimly lit steakhouse in the Seaport district, the kind of establishment where the menus did not list prices and the waitstaff hovered like silent ghosts. He had been riding a high of absolute euphoria all week, utterly convinced that his master plan was unfolding with flawless precision. He ordered a $300 bottle of Reserve Pinot Noir, without glancing at the sommelier swirling the crimson liquid in his crystal glass, with the practiced ease of a man who believed he owned the world. I sat across from him in a tailored emerald dress, playing the role of the subdued, compliant spouse to absolute perfection. I watched him devour a plate of freshly shucked oysters, unfazed by the reality that the credit card he planned to use to pay for this meal was stretched to its absolute maximum limit. I knew his financial footprint better than he did. He was floating on a toxic cloud of borrowed equity, stolen savings, and unearned arrogance. "You know," Cassidy Nolan said, leaning back against the plush velvet booth and unbuttoning his suit jacket, "I have to admit I was worried about how you would handle this transition. You have always been so stubborn about money, so defensive. But seeing you sign that deed, seeing you finally trust my vision, it showed real growth." I picked up my steak knife, feeling the heavy serrated silver in my hand. I sliced through my filet mignon with slow, deliberate precision. The meat was cooked rare, bleeding slightly onto the pristine white porcelain plate. I kept my eyes focused on the task, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing the cold contempt burning behind my retinas. "I am glad you finally learned to be a team player," Nolan continued, taking a long, arrogant swallow of his expensive wine. "That is what marriage is about. Compromise, understanding your role. A good wife obeys her husband's financial lead. Look at where my strategy is taking us. We are consolidating our wealth, maximizing our tax exemptions, and building a true family empire. My parents are thrilled, by the way. They feel so welcomed." He was practically glowing with the thrill of his own manufactured dominance. He truly believed he had broken my spirit. He thought his aggressive bullying and financial theft had successfully beaten me into submission. He thought the house was his, the money was his, and my total obedience was permanently secured. I chewed a piece of steak swallowed and dabbed the corners of my mouth with a linen napkin. I looked directly into his eyes, allowing a serene, vacant smile to rest on my face. I completely agree, Nolan. I said, my voice dropping into a smooth, melodic whisper that masked the steel underneath. Tomorrow everyone will get exactly what they deserve. Nolan chuckled, a deep, satisfied sound that vibrated in his chest. Exactly, he said, completely misinterpreting my words as ultimate submission. Tomorrow is going to be a brand new day for this family. We are moving forward. No more secrets, no more separate accounts, just pure unified progress. I took a slow sip of my water, letting him bask in his delusion. He had no idea that his mother had already signed away her primary residence to a predatory corporate buyer for 40% below market value. He had no idea that the quitclaim deed resting in his leather briefcase was a legally void piece of trash signed with the name of a fake offshore casino. He had no idea that his parents were packing their entire lives into cardboard boxes, preparing to forcefully move into a heavily secured property that they would never be allowed to enter. He was sitting across from me, lecturing me on financial leadership, while his entire existence was currently dangling over a gaping, bottomless abyss. The waiter approached our table with silent efficiency, placing the leather billfold discreetly near Nolan's elbow. Nolan did not even flinch. He casually retrieved his heavy platinum credit card and dropped it onto the receipt. I knew exactly which account that card was linked to. It was the secondary line of credit he had secretly opened 3 months ago, the one that was currently sitting $3 below its maximum limit. I watched the waiter walk away with the card, mentally counting down the seconds. Nolan continued talking about his grand plans, oblivious to the impending humiliation. He was discussing hiring a landscape architect to redesign my backyard when the waiter returned. The young man looked visibly uncomfortable. He leaned down, keeping his voice respectfully low. "I apologize, sir, but this card was declined. Do you have another form of payment?" Nolan's smile vanished instantly. His face flushed a dark, angry red. He snatched the card from the leather folder, his ego punctured. "That is impossible," he snapped, digging aggressively into his wallet. "Run it again. The machine must be malfunctioning. I have pristine credit." He handed the waiter a different card, one that I knew was tied directly to his personal checking account, the same account he had used to funnel my stolen savings to his mother's creditors. I watched him seethe, his fragile masculinity, bruised by a simple restaurant transaction. It was a microscopic preview of the total devastation awaiting him in less than 12 hours. As Nolan continued to scowl at the retreating waiter, a soft vibration pulsed against my thigh. My phone was resting silently in my lap, hidden beneath the thick linen table napkin. I glanced down, shielding the glowing screen with my palm. It was a text message from Terrence. "Vanessa just packed her bags. She thinks we are moving into the basement suite tomorrow. IRS Form 3949-A. Tax fraud report is filed and ready." I locked my phone and slid it back into my pocket. The trap was perfectly set. I smiled, taking one final victorious sip of my red wine. Let the absolute, utterly catastrophic demolition of their fake empire begin. At 8 o'clock, the crisp Friday morning air was interrupted. I stood in my kitchen, freshly brewed coffee, warming my hands through the ceramic mug, watching the live feed from my security cameras. The heavy rumble of diesel engines echoed down the quiet suburban street, a stark contrast to the usual morning birdsong. 4 massive moving trucks turned the corner and lumbered toward my property. The lead driver hopped the curb, his massive dual tires sinking deep into my meticulously manicured front lawn, crushing the expensive imported sod I had installed just last spring. The other 3 trucks followed his destructive path, tearing deep, muddy trenches across the pristine green grass, parking haphazardly across the wide concrete driveway. The passenger door of the lead truck swung open, and Barbara stepped out into the crisp morning air. She was wearing a floor-length designer fur coat An absurd choice for moving day paired with oversized sunglasses and diamond jewelry. She looked like a deposed monarch arriving to reclaim her stolen throne. She gestured wildly with her manicured hands, barking harsh orders at a crew of 5 burly contractors who were climbing out of the trailing vehicles. The men looked tired and apathetic, carrying heavy canvas tool bags, thick extension cords, and most alarmingly, 2 steel sledgehammers. Barbara pointed directly toward the large bay window of my home office, the exact room she had designated for her new luxury walk-in closet. Nolan emerged from the second truck, slamming the heavy metal door behind him. He marched up the crushed lawn, his chest puffed out, radiating an unearned sense of absolute authority. He smoothed the lapels of his expensive suit jacket, clearly attempting to embody the role of the undisputed lord of the manor. He bypassed the front gate entirely and stepped directly onto my mahogany front porch, his heavy leather shoes tracking thick clumps of mud onto the pristine wood. He did not bother to ring the doorbell. He began pounding his fist against the solid oak front door, the heavy thuds vibrating through the entryway. He was putting on a magnificent show of dominance for his mother and the hired demolition crew. I watched him through the peephole for a long, silent moment. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, savoring the rich, bitter flavor. I smoothed the front of my tailored cashmere lounge set, ensuring my appearance was absolutely flawless. I wanted to project nothing but serene, untouchable power. I reached out and unfastened the heavy deadbolt. I pulled the massive oak door open, stepping smoothly out onto the porch. The crisp morning breeze washed over me, carrying the sharp scent of diesel exhaust and crushed grass. I held my steaming mug with both hands, projecting an aura of total domestic tranquility. Nolan dropped his fist, a smug, victorious smile instantly spreading across his face. He puffed his chest out even further, stepping aggressively into my personal space. "Open the door, Cassidy," he demanded, his voice laced with heavy condescension. "The contractors charge by the hour, and my mother has a very tight schedule today. We need them in the office immediately to start the demolition. Do not make this harder than it has to be. You lost. It is time to be an adult and accept the new reality." Barbara pushed her way past the contractors, her fur coat swishing dramatically around her ankles. She stopped next to her son, crossing her arms tightly over her chest. "Tell your little maid to start packing up your office." "Cassidy," Barbara sneered, her voice dripping with venomous entitlement. "That room is officially mine now, and if you are good, I might let you keep a shelf in the basement for your things." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of fear or intimidation. I simply smiled, a cold, terrifying smile that caused Nolan's smug expression to falter for a fraction of a second. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my coffee, letting the silence stretch until it became heavy and suffocating. "I am afraid there will be no demolition today, Barbara," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly composed. "And Nolan, I highly suggest you step off my porch before you are forcefully removed." Nolan let out a sharp, mocking laugh, shaking his head in feigned disbelief. Still fighting Cassidy, he scoffed, stepping even closer. "You really do not know when you are beaten. You have absolutely no authority here anymore. I own half of this estate, and I say the contractors go in right now." He reached out his hand, gripping the brass handle of the front door, attempting to forcefully push his way past me into the foyer. I did not move to block him. I simply stepped slightly to the side and allowed the door to swing fully open. The heavy oak door swung wide, revealing the grand sunlit foyer of my home. But instead of an empty hallway, the wide entryway was currently occupied by a formidable wall of absolute unyielding authority. 3 heavily built private security guards stepped forward, their black tactical uniforms crisp and intimidating. Each guard was visibly armed, their hands resting securely near their duty belts, their faces locked in expressions of stony, uncompromising discipline. They moved in perfect unison, stepping directly into the doorway, completely blocking any possible entry into the house. Behind them, the unmistakable glint of silver badges caught the morning light. 2 uniformed local police officers stepped out from the shadows of the hallway, their expressions stern and highly observant. Nolan froze, his hand suspended near the handle. His arrogant smirk vanished instantly, replaced by profound, unadulterated shock. He stumbled backward, his eyes darting frantically between the armed security team and the uniformed police officers. Barbara let out a sharp, very loud, and completely undignified gasp. I stood perfectly still holding my steaming mug, enjoying the complete devastation of their reality. The silence lasted for exactly 3 seconds before Barbara completely lost her mind. She lunged forward, her heavy fur coat flapping around her ankles, her face contorted into a mask of absolute unhinged fury. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face, screaming at the top of her lungs. "Arrest her!" she shrieked, directing her rage at the 2 local police officers standing behind my private security detail. "Arrest this psychotic woman right now! She is illegally blocking us from entering our own property. My son owns half of this house. He has the official deed. We have hired legal contractors to begin scheduled renovations, and she is preventing us from accessing our legally obtained asset." Nolan snapped out of his temporary paralysis, desperate to regain control of the narrative in front of his mother and the hired demolition crew. He stepped up beside Barbara, squaring his shoulders and attempting to project the false authority he had relied on for years. "Officers, this is a simple domestic dispute," Nolan declared, using his most patronizing corporate voice. "My wife is prone to emotional outbursts. She is upset about some minor remodeling decisions I authorized. I am a 50% stakeholder in this estate, and I have every legal right to initiate these changes. Please ask these private security guards to step aside so my contractors can get to work." The contractors, meanwhile, had stopped dead in their tracks. They were seasoned construction workers, not hired thugs. The moment they saw armed private security and uniformed police officers, they immediately lowered their sledgehammers and began slowly backing away toward their trucks. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with whatever catastrophic domestic implosion was happening on my front porch. The lead police officer, a tall, imposing man with graying temples, stepped forward. He did not look amused. He did not look like a man who was about to cater to Nolan's arrogant demands. He looked at Barbara's hysterical gesturing, then at Nolan's fake confidence, and finally he turned his calm, assessing gaze toward me. "Ma'am," the officer said, his voice deep and authoritative, "we received a call from you regarding a scheduled trespassing incident and unauthorized property destruction. Can you please explain what is happening here?" I placed my ceramic coffee mug on the small wrought iron table next to the door. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of panic. I simply reached into the inner pocket of my cashmere lounge coat and retrieved a slim leather-bound portfolio. I handed it directly to the lead officer. "Officer," I said, my voice projecting absolute unshakable calm, "this property is entirely owned and operated by the Sterling Family Trust. I am the sole resident and the primary beneficiary. The man standing on my lawn is my soon-to-be ex-husband. He has absolutely zero legal ownership, equity, or financial stake in this estate. The woman screaming next to him is his mother. They have brought a demolition crew to my primary residence without my consent, without legal authorization, and without any valid permits. These people are actively trespassing on protected land with the documented intent to destroy private property." The officer opened the leather portfolio. Inside were the certified, notarized, and unassailable trust documents Arthur had meticulously prepared. The officer spent a long, silent minute reviewing the heavy parchment paper, his eyes scanning the official state seals and the binding legal terminology. The silence on the porch was deafening. Barbara had stopped shrieking, her mouth hanging slightly open as she watched the officer read the undeniable proof of my total ownership. Nolan's face was rapidly draining of color. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was waiting for the ground to rush up and meet him. He could not comprehend how I possessed such definitive official documentation. He had built his entire strategy on bullying, manipulation, and the assumption that I would simply fold under his aggressive pressure. He never anticipated a legally fortified defense. The officer closed the portfolio and handed it back to me with a respectful nod. He turned his attention back to Nolan and Barbara, his posture shifting from observational to strictly authoritative. "Sir," the officer said, addressing Nolan directly, "I have reviewed the certified property records. This house belongs exclusively to the Sterling Family Trust. Your name is nowhere on these documents. You have no legal authority to authorize renovations, and you certainly have no right to bring a demolition crew onto this property. I am going to have to ask you and your contractors to vacate these premises immediately. If you refuse, you will be arrested for criminal trespassing." Nolan's eyes went wide. His carefully constructed illusion was disintegrating right in front of his face. He shook his head frantically, his breathing becoming shallow and rapid. "No, no, that is a lie," Nolan sputtered, his voice cracking with rising panic. "That is impossible. She is lying to you. I have the paperwork. I have the signed agreement. I forced her to sign it. It is legally binding." Nolan dropped to one knee on the muddy porch, frantically unzipping his leather briefcase. His hands were shaking so violently. He tore through the organized files until he finally found it. He retrieved his prized possession. He jumped back to his feet, waving the paper frantically in the officer's face. "Look at this!" Nolan shouted, his voice echoing loudly down the quiet street. "This document is a valid quitclaim deed. She signed it over to me. I am a legal owner. You cannot kick me off my own property." The police officer reached out and calmly took the paper from Nolan's trembling hand. He simply looked at it, letting out a heavy sigh. He handed the useless piece of paper back to Nolan. "Sir," the officer said, shaking his head, "this was not notarized, and it was not signed by the trustees. You have no rights here." The officer handed the useless piece of paper back to Nolan. The crisp morning air suddenly felt entirely devoid of oxygen. Nolan stared at the unnotarized document resting in his trembling hand, as if it had suddenly caught fire. The arrogant posture he had maintained for months completely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, pathetic shell of a man. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but no sound came out. The illusion of his absolute dominance was shattered, replaced by the terrifying reality of his own sheer incompetence. He looked from the stoic police officers to the heavily armed security guards, and finally his desperate gaze landed on me. "Cassidy, what are you doing?" Nolan pleaded, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, frantic whine. His previous commanding tone was entirely gone, replaced by the desperate begging of a cornered animal. "I am your husband. You cannot do this to me. We are a team. You are my wife. We are supposed to build our future together. You cannot just lock me out of my own home in front of my mother and these contractors. Please just tell them to leave so we can go inside and talk about this like rational adults. We can fix this." I did not offer him a sympathetic smile. I did not soften my gaze or show even a fraction of a biological emotional response. I simply reached back into the foyer and picked up the thick, heavy leather binder I had resting on the entryway console table. I walked slowly to the edge of the porch, the security team parting seamlessly to allow me to stand directly in front of him. I dropped the heavy binder onto the wooden railing with a resounding thud that made Barbara physically flinch. "You ceased being my husband the exact moment you committed federal wire fraud," I stated, my voice ringing out clearly across the manicured lawn. I unclasped the binder and flipped it open, revealing hundreds of pages of meticulously highlighted banking statements, transaction logs, and internal routing numbers. Did you genuinely believe that a senior wealth advisor, a woman who manages 9-figure portfolios for a living, would simply fail to notice $250,000 actively bleeding out of a joint checking account? Nolan took a stumbling step backward, his eyes locking onto the familiar bank logos printed on the pages. The color drained from his face so rapidly I thought he might actually pass out right there on the crushed grass. He raised his hands defensively, shaking his head in a frantic, jerky motion. "I know exactly what you did, Nolan." I continued, my tone sharp and completely unyielding. "I know about the offshore accounts. I know about the fabricated consulting invoices you used to mask the transfers. I know you systematically drained $250,000 of my personal savings, funneled it through a series of shell LLCs you established under your friend's name, and then deposited the laundered funds directly into a secondary checking account. You thought you were a criminal mastermind, executing a flawless financial maneuver. You were actually leaving a blazing digital paper trail directly to your own federal indictment. I have already compiled every single transaction. I have the IP addresses, the timestamps, and the routing sequences. I handed the entire portfolio over to Arthur, and yesterday afternoon, I officially reported every single unauthorized transfer directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The word FBI hung in the crisp morning air like a suspended executioner's blade. The two police officers standing behind me immediately straightened their posture, their hands resting closer to their duty belts, suddenly realizing the massive scale of the criminal situation they had just walked into. The contractors, who had been lingering near their trucks watching the drama unfold, immediately turned around, threw their sledgehammers into the truck beds, and scrambled into the cabs of their vehicles. They wanted absolutely zero association with a federal fraud investigation. Engines roared to life, and within seconds, the demolition crew was speeding away, leaving deep tire tracks in the mud. Nolan was practically hyperventilating. He clutched his chest, his eyes darting frantically around the street as if expecting black unmarked vans to suddenly swarm the neighborhood. "Cassidy, please," he gasped, tears actually forming in the corners of his eyes. "I can explain the money. I was going to put it back. I was making investments for our future. I was trying to secure a better yield. You cannot send me to federal prison. I am your family." "You are a parasite," I replied coldly, snapping the heavy binder shut. "And your little investments were nothing more than desperate payouts to cover your mother's catastrophic mistakes." I turned my gaze away from Nolan and looked directly at Barbara. She was standing frozen near the muddy tire tracks, her lavish fur coat suddenly looking absurdly heavy. Her oversized sunglasses slipped down her nose, revealing eyes wide with absolute unadulterated terror. She was no longer looking at me with her usual wealthy condescension. She was staring at the thick leather binder resting on the porch railing, as if it were a ticking bomb. I watched the devastating realization hit her in real time. I watched her perfectly manicured hands begin to shake uncontrollably. The smug, entitled matriarch who had arrived ready to demolish my home office was completely gone. She finally understood the magnitude of what Nolan had done. She realized that the $250,000 Nolan had miraculously produced to pay off her aggressive underground gambling debts was not a clever loan or a successful business bonus. It was stolen money. It was illicitly transferred, federally tracked, and highly illegal capital. Barbara instantly realized that the very money she had used to save herself from ruthless, violent debt collectors was now the central evidence in a massive federal crime, and she was now the absolute primary recipient of the stolen federal funds. Barbara stood completely frozen on the ruined grass, the color draining from her face as the reality of federal prison materialized before her eyes. She clutched her fur coat tightly against her chest, her breathing shallow and ragged, staring at the leather binder as if it were a venomous snake. Nolan was babbling incoherently, pleading with the police officers who were now eyeing him with severe professional scrutiny. He was attempting to backtrack, claiming it was a simple misunderstanding between spouses, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of tires crunching on gravel. A sleek black sedan pulled smoothly into the driveway, maneuvering carefully around the deep, muddy trenches left by the fleeing, moving trucks. The tinted windows rolled up, projecting an air of cold corporate efficiency that sharply contrasted with the hysterical circus currently occupying my front lawn. The driver's side door opened and Terrence stepped out. He was dressed impeccably in a custom-tailored charcoal suit, his posture absolutely rigid and his facial expression entirely unreadable as he surveyed the absolute chaos unfolding on the lawn. In his right hand, he carried a slim, silver briefcase. Terrence was the quiet, hard-working husband of Nolan's younger sister, Vanessa, a woman who had spent her entire adult life treating him like a walking, talking ATM. I watched from the porch as Vanessa scrambled out of the passenger side of Nolan's abandoned SUV, hauling two oversized Louis Vuitton duffel bags over her shoulders. She had arrived expecting to casually move into my renovated basement suite, completely oblivious to the legal demolition of her family's fake empire. When she saw Terrence standing in the driveway, a look of desperate relief washed over her heavily contoured face. She dropped one of the bags onto the concrete, the expensive leather scraping loudly against the pavement, and sprinted toward her husband. She was fully expecting him to step in, use his corporate authority, and somehow fix the catastrophic mess unraveling around them. "Terrence, thank God you are finally here!" Vanessa shrieked, her voice shrill and demanding. She pointed a frantic manicured finger toward me and the wall of armed security guards. "Tell them who we are. Tell them to back off right now. Cassidy has completely lost her mind. She is trying to lock us out of the house. Nolan has the deed, and we have the absolute right to move into the basement suite today. You need to call your lawyers and have these security guards arrested for harassment. Do something useful for once in your life." She reached out, intending to grab his arm and physically pull him toward the escalating conflict on the porch. Vanessa was entirely accustomed to ordering Terrence around, treating his compliance as an unconditional guarantee. She had spent their 5-year marriage openly mocking his quiet demeanor, spending his hard-earned salary on luxury goods she used to impress her superficial friends, and demanding he fund her relentless need to keep up with Nolan's manufactured wealth. She expected him to immediately jump to her defense to shield her from the humiliating reality check currently taking place on my property. But Terrence did not move to comfort her. He did not reach out to take her heavy designer bags. He did not even look at the police officers or my security detail. As Vanessa lunged toward him, Terrence performed a smooth, deliberate sidestep, allowing her momentum to carry her awkwardly past him. She stumbled in her high heels, barely catching her balance, and whipped around with a look of pure indignation. "What is wrong with you?" She snapped, her face flushing an angry crimson. "Did you not hear me? Fix this!" Terrence calmly placed his silver briefcase on the hood of his sedan. The sharp metallic clicks of the latches echoed across the driveway, drawing the attention of both the police officers and my security team. He opened the lid and carefully extracted a thick manila envelope. He turned to face his wife, his expression devoid of the quiet, accommodating submission she had weaponized for half a decade. He looked at her with cold, clinical detachment. "I am not fixing anything for you ever again," Vanessa Terrence stated, his voice ringing out with crystal-clear precision. He extended his hand, pressing the heavy envelope directly into her chest. She reflexively grabbed it, looking down at the thick stack of papers with sudden creeping confusion. "Those are official divorce papers," Terrence announced loudly enough for Barbara and Nolan to hear every single syllable. "My lawyer filed them at the courthouse first thing this morning. You have been legally served." Vanessa gasped, her mouth falling open. She looked from the envelope to Terrence, unable to compute the absolute rebellion of her compliant husband. "You cannot be serious," she stammered, her voice dropping to a panicked whisper. Over a silly argument about moving, Terrence let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "It is not about the basement, Vanessa. Keep looking inside the envelope. There is a second packet underneath the divorce filing. It is a highly detailed copy of an official Internal Revenue Service audit. I spent the last 3 months working quietly with a forensic accountant after I noticed several alarming discrepancies on my credit report. You thought I was stupid. You thought you could just quietly open 6 different premium credit cards using my social security number, forge my digital signature, and max them out to fund your pathetic, shallow lifestyle." The forensic accountant verified every single transaction. Terrence continued, his voice sharp and unyielding. "You committed $80,000 of identity theft and credit card fraud. I have handed the entire file over to the authorities." Vanessa's weak knees buckled instantly beneath her. She collapsed heavily onto the hard concrete driveway, sobbing loudly and hysterically as her remaining oversized designer bags toppled over, spilling her incredibly expensive imported cosmetics and stolen luxury items completely across the dirty, mud-stained pavement, completely exposed in front of everyone watching. Vanessa's hysterical sobs echoed across the concrete driveway. She remained on her knees, frantically grasping at the spilled contents of her designer luggage. Terrence did not look down at her. He adjusted his tailored suit jacket, turned, and walked back to his black sedan. He drove away without a backward glance, leaving his wife marooned in the wreckage of her own making. Nolan was paralyzed on the muddy grass, his useless quitclaim deed hanging limply from his fingers. He stared blankly at Vanessa, incapable of processing the rapid demolition of his family. The private security guards maintained their formation on my front porch, observing the absolute collapse of the people. The local police officers exchanged a knowing look, recognizing that no arrests for trespassing were needed because the trespassers were actively destroying themselves. Barbara broke the stunned silence. She tore her gaze away from Vanessa's pathetic display and snapped her head toward the second moving truck. Her face was a mask of indignity and revulsion. She wrapped her fur coat tighter around her body, attempting to physically shield herself from the sheer embarrassment. "Gregory," she screamed, her voice cracking with frantic urgency. "Gregory, get out of that truck right now. I am completely done with this nonsense. We are leaving." Gregory Nolan's father slowly opened the passenger door of the second U-Haul and stepped down onto the driveway. He looked entirely exhausted, a man who had spent 4 decades trailing behind his wife's aggressive ambition. He wore a faded sweater and carried a small cardboard box of personal belongings. He looked at Nolan's defeated posture, then at Vanessa sobbing on the ground, and finally at his wife. He did not say a word. He simply stood there waiting for his next order. "Tell these idiot drivers to turn the trucks around," Barbara commanded, pointing a manicured finger at the lead driver. "Tell them to take our things back to the house immediately. I refuse to stand here and be subjected to this psychotic circus for another minute. We are going home. Nolan can stay here and sort out whatever ridiculous legal misunderstanding his ungrateful wife has fabricated. We will call our own lawyers from the comfort of our own estate and handle this properly. Make them turn the trucks around right now." Gregory nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping as he turned toward the drivers. He raised a hand, signaling for them to start their engines. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. The warm, rich liquid felt incredibly soothing against the crisp autumn chill. I lowered the ceramic mug and cleared my throat. The sound was soft, yet it instantly commanded the attention of everyone in the driveway. "Go back where Barbara," I asked, my voice carrying a smooth melodic cadence that completely masked the absolute finality of my words. Barbara stopped halfway to the moving truck. She slowly turned back to face me, her eyes narrowing with pure venom. "To my home, Cassidy," Barbara spat, her tone dripping with extreme condescension. "To the massive, beautiful estate that my husband and I have owned for 30 years. The home I am returning to while my son finalizes the paperwork to evict you from this property." I smiled, allowing a look of genuine, profound pity to cross my face. "I am afraid you cannot do that, Barbara," I said softly. Barbara let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "And why exactly is that? Are your security guards going to barricade my driveway too?" "No," I replied, taking a step forward. "The new owners have already done that. The corporate buyer finalized the absolute cash sale of your property yesterday afternoon at exactly 4 o'clock. The massive wire transfer cleared your designated holding account. The new property management company took immediate possession of the estate last night. They have already changed every lock on the exterior doors, reprogrammed the gate security codes, and activated a new alarm system." Barbara froze. Her mock laughter died instantly in her throat. The heavy fur coat suddenly seemed to weigh her down, her posture sagging as she stared at me. "What are you talking about?" she whispered, the venom completely drained from her voice. "You sold your primary residence to a predatory corporate liquidation firm for 40% below market value," I explained. "You did it because Nolan convinced you that transferring the cash into his offshore accounts would create a brilliant tax loophole to hide your assets from the creditors you owe. But Nolan is not a financial genius, Barbara. He is a fool who fell for a basic corporate trapping scheme. That tax loophole never existed. The offshore accounts are fake, and the money you transferred yesterday was seized by the federal government." I watched the color completely drain from Barbara's face. Her heavily powdered skin turned a sickly, translucent shade of gray. The absolute reality of her situation crashed into her like a physical blow. She had voluntarily signed away the deed to the only property she owned. She had packed her entire life into 4 rented trucks. She had handed over the total equity of her 30-year marriage to a son who had just been exposed as a federal criminal. Barbara raised a trembling hand to her chest, her fingers clawing at the expensive fur collar of her coat. Her mouth opened, but she could not draw in enough air to speak. She stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the uneven pavement. She collided heavily with the side of the lead U-Haul truck, the metal paneling groaning under her sudden weight. She slid down the side of the massive yellow truck, her knees buckling completely, until she hit the cold concrete. She was sitting in the dirt next to the massive diesel tires, gasping for breath, clutching her chest in sheer, unadulterated panic. She finally understood the absolute, inescapable truth. She had no estate. She had no money. She had no shelter. She was completely, legally, and permanently homeless. Nolan stood paralyzed on the damp concrete, surrounded by the absolute wreckage of his manufactured reality. To his left, his mother was hyperventilating against the muddy tire of a rented moving truck, clutching her chest as the reality of her permanent homelessness set in. To his right, his sister Vanessa remained sprawled on the driveway, weeping hysterically over her impending divorce and federal tax fraud indictment. The luxurious empire Nolan had so arrogantly boasted about just 20 minutes ago had been completely obliterated. He looked at the 2 uniformed police officers standing silently behind me, waiting for a single nod from me to move forward. He looked at the 3 private security guards planted like stone gargoyles across my front porch. Finally, his bloodshot, terrified eyes snapped back to me. The suffocating weight of federal prison finally crashed down upon his shoulders. He was entirely trapped. The aggressive, condescending bully who had confidently strutted up my driveway had vanished. In his place stood a broken, terrified coward. Heavy beads of cold sweat rolled down his forehead, soaking the collar of his suit. His chest heaved with shallow breaths as his mind searched for an escape route that did not exist. He took a hesitant step forward, his hands raised in a pathetic gesture of surrender. His knees shook beneath the fabric of his trousers. "Cassidy, please!" Nolan begged, his voice cracking into a desperate whine. "I am begging you. Please, I will pay it back. Every single cent. I will work 3 jobs. I will sell everything I own. Just please do not send me to jail. I would not survive in federal prison. We can figure this out between us. Keep the house. Keep everything. Just withdraw the FBI report. Please have some mercy." I stood perfectly still on the porch, looking down at the man who had spent months trying to destroy my life, steal my assets, and break my spirit. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no residual affection. I felt nothing but the cold, satisfying clarity of total victory. I reached into the pocket of my coat and pulled out a thick, impeccably organized stack of legal documents securely bound in a navy blue folder. I stepped down off the porch and walked slowly toward him. The guards parted silently to let me pass. I stopped exactly 3 feet away from him, close enough to smell the sour stench of fear radiating from his sweat-soaked skin. I held the folder out, presenting it to him with the cold efficiency of a corporate executioner. "I am entirely out of mercy, Nolan," I stated, my voice ringing with crystalline authority. "But I am willing to offer you a singular, non-negotiable transaction. Inside this folder is a fully drafted, comprehensive divorce settlement. My legal team finalized the terms late last night. You are going to take this pen and you are going to initial every single page." Nolan stared at the navy blue folder as if it were coated in poison. He reached out with a violently trembling hand and took it, flipping open the heavy cover. His eyes darted frantically across the dense legal paragraphs, desperately searching for a loophole. There were none. The contract was an ironclad masterpiece of legal domination. "Let me summarize the terms so there is no confusion." I continued, my tone sharp and uncompromising. "You will sign away all rights to alimony or spousal support permanently. You will formally relinquish any claim to this estate, the Sterling Family Trust, and all my personal assets. You will assume 100% of the marital debt you secretly accumulated over the last 12 months. Furthermore, you will sign the legally binding promissory note accepting total personal liability for the $250,000 you stole from my accounts. You will be responsible for every penny of that stolen capital." Nolan choked on a sob, his eyes widening in horror as he read the specific financial clauses outlined on the pages before him. "Cassidy, I cannot sign this," he gasped, clutching the folder to his chest as if trying to protect himself from the words. "This will leave me with millions in debt. I have no job. I have no savings. My reputation in the financial sector is destroyed. I will be ruined for the rest of my life. You are asking me to sign my own financial death warrant." I leaned in slightly, lowering my voice so that only he and the police officers standing nearby could hear my next words. "You ruined yourself, Nolan. I am simply providing the paperwork. You have exactly two options. You can sign this agreement right here, right now, and walk away with nothing but the clothes on your back and the debt you rightfully earned. Or I give the signal. Do it now, or the police officers standing behind me will arrest you for grand larceny and federal wire fraud. You will be handcuffed in front of your mother, dragged into a squad car, and spend 20 years in prison. The choice is yours." Nolan looked past me, making direct eye contact with the lead police officer. The officer did not smile. He unclipped the heavy steel handcuffs from his belt, the metallic clinking sound piercing the morning air. It was the absolute final nail in Nolan's coffin. The last shred of his resistance shattered. "Okay," Nolan whispered, tears streaming down his pale cheeks. "Okay, I will sign it." He turned heavily on his heels, dragging his feet across the driveway like a condemned man walking to the gallows. He stumbled toward the police cruiser parked near the curb. He placed the thick blue folder flat against the cold metal hood. He clicked the pen, his body trembling so violently that he could barely keep the tip of the ink steady. With a ragged, defeated sob, Nolan signed away his future on the hood of the police cruiser, sealing his own absolute destruction. The click of the retractable pen echoed across the driveway as Nolan let it slip from his trembling fingers. It bounced off the hood of the police cruiser and clattered onto the concrete. The lead officer stepped forward, picking up the navy blue folder and inspecting the signatures. He gave a single curt nod and walked the documents over to where I stood on the porch. I took the folder, the weight of it in my hands, signifying the absolute end of the parasitic attachment that had drained my life for years. I looked past the officer and saw Terrence. He stopped halfway to his black sedan, his hand resting on the door handle. He looked at the folder in my hands, then at the pathetic scene unfolding on the grass. Silently, he closed his car door, turned around, and walked back up the driveway. He climbed the wooden steps of the porch and took his place right beside me. We did not exchange a celebratory glance or victorious smile. We simply stood shoulder to shoulder, two people who had been mercilessly used for our financial stability, united in the quiet dignity of reclaiming our lives. The lead officer turned his attention back to the driveway, radiating absolute authority. He unclipped his radio, spoke a brief code into the receiver, and then addressed the shivering, pathetic group of trespassers. "You have exactly 2 minutes to vacate this private property," the officer commanded, his voice booming over the manicured lawn. "If any of you are still standing on this concrete when my timer goes off, you will be arrested for criminal trespassing and escorted to jail. Do not attempt to enter the residence. Do not attempt to negotiate. Gather yourselves, get into your vehicles, and leave immediately." Barbara let out a sharp, breathless wail from her position in the mud. She looked up at the officer, her expensive mascara running down her cheeks in dark, jagged rivers. "We have absolutely nowhere to go," she sobbed, clutching the lapels of her ruined fur coat. "You cannot just throw us out onto the street like stray animals. We are prominent members of this community." The officer did not even blink. "Ma'am, you have 1 minute and 40 seconds, he replied coldly. "I highly suggest you instruct your husband to start the engine of that moving truck." Near the back of the driveway, the foreman of the hired moving crew had been watching the entire spectacle unfold. He had seen the police arrive, witnessed Nolan signing legal documents under duress, and heard the absolute confirmation that the family's assets had been seized by federal authorities. He looked at the heavy sledgehammers and moving dollies his crew had unloaded, then looked at the sobbing matriarch in the mud. The math was incredibly simple. He turned to his men and blew a sharp whistle. "Pack it up, boys!" The foreman yelled, his voice carrying clearly over the sound of Vanessa's continued weeping. "We are not seeing a single dime for this job. Toss the gear in the flatbed. We are out of here." The remaining contractors immediately dropped the heavy wooden crates. The loud thuds of boxes hitting the asphalt made Nolan flinch violently. The workers swiftly grabbed their sledgehammers, tossed them aggressively into the back of their rusted pickup truck, and slammed the tailgate shut. Within seconds, they had piled into the cab. The truck's engine roared to life, kicking up a thick cloud of gray exhaust as they peeled out of the driveway, completely abandoning the family to their fate. Gregory finally moved. The passive, defeated man walked slowly over to the mud puddle where his wife sat. He grabbed Barbara by the arm, hoisting her up with a rough, unceremonious yank that lacked any of his usual subservient gentleness. He did not offer her a comforting word or a handkerchief. He simply pulled her toward the cab of the massive yellow truck they had rented. Nolan stumbled blindly toward the same vehicle, his expensive suit stained with sweat and dirt. He looked completely hollowed out, a vacant shell of the arrogant man who had tried to steal my life. He climbed into the cramped middle seat of the cab, staring straight ahead at the dashboard, unable to look at me, his mother, or the police officers. Vanessa was still on the ground, frantically trying to shove a shattered eyeshadow palette into her ruined designer duffel bag. She looked up and saw Terrence standing beside me on the porch, his posture radiating absolute indifference. She let out a guttural scream of pure frustration, grabbed her torn bag, and hobbled on broken high heels toward the second truck parked near the curb. She hauled herself into the driver's seat, slamming the heavy door with a resounding crash that rattled the windows. I stood perfectly still next to Terrence, on the elevated porch, our visual vantage point granting us a complete, unobstructed view of the final act. We watched as the allegedly perfect, wealthy family was reduced to piling into the cramped cabs of rented moving trucks. They had arrived expecting to execute a hostile takeover of my property, armed with a fraudulent deed and supreme arrogance. They were leaving with absolutely nothing but the clothes they wore and the massive federal debts they had rightfully earned. Gregory turned the key in the ignition. The diesel engine of the truck sputtered, coughed, and finally roared to life, vibrating the ground beneath our feet. As the truck began to slowly lurch forward, Barbara rolled down the passenger side window. Her face twisted into a hideous mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She leaned out of the window, her mouth opening wide as she prepared to unleash a final, venomous tirade of curses at me. As she drew a breath to scream, Gregory slammed the gearshift into drive. The violent grinding of the transmission completely drowned out her voice, leaving her shrieking silently just as the truck pulled away. Exactly 1 month later, the sterile fluorescent lighting of the downtown federal courthouse replaced the crisp autumn sunshine of my front porch. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind me with a resounding, finalizing thud. The courtroom was an arena of cold, polished mahogany and absolute, unforgiving justice. I sat perfectly straight at the plaintiff table, flanked by my lead attorney and the forensic accountant, who had meticulously traced every single stolen dollar. Across the center aisle sat Nolan. The month had aged him a decade. His once immaculate custom suits hung loosely off his dramatically thinner frame, looking pathetic. His previously arrogant posture was completely gone. He sat hunched over, his hands clasped tightly together on the table, refusing to make eye contact with anyone in the gallery or on the bench. The divorce proceedings were incredibly brutal, clinically efficient, and entirely swift. Judge Morrison, a notoriously strict woman with 30 years of bench experience and absolutely zero tolerance for white-collar fraud, adjusted her reading glasses and stared down at the massive mountain of evidence we had submitted. She did not ask for lengthy testimonies or allow Nolan's bargain-rate public defender to offer any pathetic, desperate excuses. The signed confession from my driveway, combined with the comprehensive digital tracking of the wire transfers and the offshore shell accounts, rendered any defense completely useless. I watched with profound, quiet satisfaction as the judge granted every single condition I had demanded in my initial filing. The gavel struck the sound block with a sharp, echoing crack that sealed Nolan's ultimate fate. I retained sole undisputed ownership of the estate, all of my personal investment portfolios, and the entirety of my retirement accounts. Nolan was officially stripped of any right to claim alimony, spousal support, or any shared marital assets. Furthermore, Judge Morrison did not just acknowledge the stolen $250,000, she legally weaponized it against him. The court mandated a maximum aggressive wage garnishment to ensure full repayment of the stolen funds, plus calculated interest, and all of my associated legal fees. Because the Federal Bureau of Investigation was still actively building their criminal wire fraud case against him, Nolan's professional reputation in the financial sector had been utterly annihilated. No reputable firm would even allow him past their lobby, let alone hire him to manage portfolios, stripped of his lucrative career and expensive cars. Nolan was forced to accept a grueling minimum wage data entry position, working the overnight shift at a logistics warehouse just to meet the court's strict repayment timeline. His new living situation was a poetic reflection of his internal decay. The man who had sneered at my beautifully renovated home, who had tried to illegally evict me to house his toxic mother, now lived in a cramped 200-square-foot studio apartment located directly above a 24-hour commercial laundromat in the industrial district. The constant mechanical humming of the heavy-duty washing machines rattled his thin floorboards. They constantly vibrated day and night. The overwhelming smell of industrial bleach and damp, moldy drywall seeped through the vents, completely permeating his only two remaining cheap suits. He had absolutely no savings, no luxury cars, and no wealthy friends left to bail him out. A massive percentage of his meager weekly paycheck was immediately seized by the state and deposited directly back into my secure accounts, leaving him barely enough cash to afford instant noodles and cheap instant coffee. Terrence's legal battle was running parallel to mine, and his victory was equally absolute inside that very same courtroom building. I watched from the courtroom gallery later that same afternoon as Terrence stood calmly before the judge, his silver briefcase resting on the table. He had spent the last 4 weeks working relentlessly with federal tax investigators, providing them with the meticulous records and forensic accounting reports he had compiled to expose his wife's massive financial deception. Vanessa's pathetic attempts to play the victim to cry and claim she had simply misunderstood the household finances were instantly shredded by the sheer volume of undeniable evidence. Terrence successfully and completely cleared his name with the Internal Revenue Service investigators that day. The judge officially absolved Terrence of any financial responsibility for the $80,000 in fraudulent credit card debt and the subsequent tax penalties that Vanessa had illegally accrued under his Social Security number. The court forcefully transferred the entire massive tax burden directly onto Vanessa's shoulders. Because Terrence had also filed for an immediate fault-based divorce, Vanessa was completely cut off from his income, his health insurance, and the comfortable subsidized lifestyle she had ruthlessly exploited for 5 years. With her fake empire destroyed and her wealthy brother completely bankrupted, Vanessa now faced a very harsh new reality. She had been forced to accept the exhausting reality of actual physical labor. She secured a humiliating low-end retail job at a discount clothing outlet inside a dying shopping mall, spending 8 hours a day folding cheap garments and dealing with angry customers. However, the true punishment arrived on her very first payday. Vanessa eagerly logged into her bank app, expecting to see her small paycheck, only to discover a balance of absolute zero. The Internal Revenue Service, armed with the court orders Terrence had secured, immediately seized her wages. They intercepted her direct deposits with unrelenting absolute force. They completely drained the account before she could even access a single dollar, funneling her entire paycheck directly toward the massive mountain of federal tax debt she owed. She was legally trapped in a relentless, exhausting cycle of hard physical labor that yielded absolutely zero financial reward, effectively working for free while the federal government systematically drained her accounts. The golden children of the family, who had spent their entire lives manipulating, stealing, and looking down on everyone else, were now firmly chained to the absolute bottom of the social ladder. They were finally paying for their terrible criminal sins. The Sterling family's financial obliteration did not end in the sterile environment of the federal courtroom. It violently bled into every single aspect of their daily existence, stripping away the luxurious facade they had weaponized for decades. Barbara and Gregory had hastily sold their heavily mortgaged suburban home, expecting to walk away with a comfortable cushion to restart their lives. Instead, the proceeds were instantly swallowed whole by the consequences of their own greed. The Internal Revenue Service, alerted by the massive fraud network Vanessa had constructed, descended upon them with terrifying, unrelenting efficiency. Combined with the exorbitant legal fees from their failed hostile takeover of my estate, the cash vanished within a matter of days. They were left with absolutely nothing. There were no hidden savings accounts, no offshore safety nets, and certainly no wealthy friends willing to extend a lifeline to convicted fraudsters. Their prestigious country club memberships were permanently revoked. Their luxury leased vehicles were unceremoniously repossessed in the middle of the night, leaving empty spaces in their former driveway. Their new residence was a stark, unforgiving monument to their spectacular downfall. Barbara and Gregory were legally forced to move into a low-income senior living facility located on the grim industrial outskirts of the city. The building was a depressing gray concrete block that smelled perpetually of boiled cabbage, cheap disinfectant, and quiet despair. Their assigned unit was a cramped single-room apartment with peeling linoleum floors and a single window that overlooked a busy exhaust-choked highway. Barbara, a woman who had once spent her afternoons dictating harsh orders to interior designers and sipping imported champagne on manicured terraces, was now forced to share a communal laundry room with the exact demographic of people she had spent her entire life mocking. Gregory, entirely stripped of his perceived patriarchal authority and stolen wealth, spent his days sitting silently in a stained armchair, staring blankly at a small television they had bought secondhand from a local pawn shop. I had not actively sought them out to witness their misery. I had entirely moved on my life, flourishing brilliantly in the complete absence of their toxic, parasitic gravity. My business was expanding rapidly, my investments were secure, and my mind was finally at absolute peace. It was a mundane, rainy Tuesday afternoon when our paths unexpectedly crossed. I had stopped at a local discount grocery store plaza on the edge of town to pick up bulk supplies for a community charity drive my firm was actively sponsoring. The store was crowded, brightly lit with harsh, flickering fluorescent bulbs, and filled with exhausted shoppers navigating narrow aisles stacked high with generic items. I was pushing my metal cart down the baking aisle, quietly checking items off my organized list, when I turned the corner and saw her standing there. Barbara stood near the discounted breakfast items, hunched over a wire shopping cart with a violently squeaky wheel. The physical transformation was absolutely staggering. The pristine, aggressive matriarch, who had confidently marched up my driveway in designer furs, was completely gone. She had aged visibly in a few short weeks. Her dyed blonde hair now showed harsh graying roots that she could no longer afford to maintain at a salon. Her skin, previously preserved by expensive monthly treatments and high-end cosmetics, looked incredibly dull, sallow, and deeply lined with the heavy burden of constant stress. She was wearing a cheap, shapeless polyester tracksuit that hung awkwardly on her shrinking, defeated frame. She was meticulously counting a small handful of crumpled paper coupons, squinting through cheap reading glasses to compare them against the bright yellow price tag on a bottom-shelf item. She looked up suddenly, sensing eyes upon her. Her tired gaze locked directly with mine across the short distance of the linoleum aisle. For a fraction of a second, the ghost of the old Barbara flared to life. Her posture stiffened defensively, her chin tilted up in a familiar gesture of superiority, and her eyes flashed with that characteristic entitled arrogance. She prepared to sneer at me, to project false dominance, to pretend this humiliating encounter was somehow completely beneath her dignity. But the harsh reality of her immediate surroundings crushed that defensive instinct before it could fully materialize. She looked at my tailored wool coat, my calm, centered demeanor, and the absolute lack of anger in my expression. I did not hurl insults at her in the grocery store. I did not point and laugh at her misfortune. I did not gloat about my legal victory or her family's spectacular, highly publicized financial ruin. I simply stopped. My cart looked her directly in the eyes and offered a polite, chillingly serene smile. That silent, polite smile was the most devastating weapon I could have possibly deployed against her fragile ego. It communicated absolute, unwavering indifference. It confirmed that she no longer held any power, any threat, or any remaining space in my mind. It shattered the last fragile remnants of her pride into microscopic pieces. Barbara's face instantly crumpled under the weight of that realization. The remaining blood drained entirely from her cheeks, leaving her looking hollow and completely defeated. The fight drained completely out of her shaking body. Her hands began to tremble so violently that she dropped her carefully organized stack of coupons onto the dirty floor. Unable to hold my confident gaze for even another second, she quickly broke eye contact, looking wildly around the aisle for an escape route. In a move of pure pathetic desperation, she grabbed a large box of generic store-brand cereal from the shelf and held it up, physically attempting to hide her face behind the cheap cardboard packaging. As I walked calmly past her down the aisle, my heels clicking rhythmically on the floor, I did not look back. Barbara remained frozen behind that cereal box, suffocating under the crushing, undeniable realization that she had officially become the exact kind of powerless person she had always mocked. 6 months after the complete financial annihilation of the Sterling family, my professional trajectory skyrocketed into an entirely new stratosphere. The quiet, relentless efficiency with which I had dismantled Nolan's fraudulent empire had not gone unnoticed in the upper echelons of the East Coast financial sector. True power whispers and the whispers surrounding my legal victories had transformed me into an absolute legend among wealth management circles. This newfound prestige culminated in an exclusive invitation to serve as the keynote speaker at the annual Women in Finance Leadership Summit held at the Boston Harbor Hotel. It was the most prestigious networking event of the year, attended by top-tier executives, managing partners, and venture capitalists who controlled billions in assets. The elegant venue buzzed with anticipation, ready to hear my highly publicized insights. I arrived at the venue wearing a sharply tailored midnight blue designer suit that projected absolute uncompromising authority. The grand ballroom was packed to maximum capacity. Crystal chandeliers cast a brilliant, validating light over the 500 industry leaders seated at round, linen-draped tables. The low hum of elite corporate networking ceased entirely as the master of ceremonies introduced me, listing my recent firm acquisitions and my flawless record in asset protection. I walked onto the elevated stage with the steady, measured confidence of a woman who had walked through absolute fire and emerged entirely unscathed. I adjusted the microphone, looking out over the sea of expectant faces, and felt a profound, deeply satisfying sense of purpose. Every carefully chosen phrase underscored a deeply personal victory, reinforcing my status not just as a survivor, but as an apex predator. My keynote address was explicitly titled Financial Abuse in Modern Marriages and the Absolute Necessity of Irrevocable Trusts. I did not deliver a dry academic lecture on tax codes or standard asset allocation. I delivered a masterclass in survival, weaponizing my own traumatic experiences to educate and empower the women in the room. I spoke with crystalline clarity about the insidious nature of financial predators who use romantic manipulation to gain access to generational wealth. I detailed the red flags of secret debt accumulation, the psychological gaslighting used to force joint account access, and the critical importance of maintaining completely independent legal counsel. The audience was absolutely captivated. Every single woman in that grand ballroom was hanging on my every word, furiously taking notes on their tablets and nodding in profound agreement. Then I delivered the final devastating blow. I did not use Nolan's name. I did not explicitly mention the Sterling family or their pathetic attempt at a hostile takeover. I simply presented a hypothetical case study that mirrored his spectacular downfall with terrifying forensic accuracy. I described a mid-level financial director who secretly accumulated massive fraudulent marital debt while attempting to illegally breach his wife's family trust. I detailed how his arrogance blinded him to the ironclad legal traps that had been meticulously set for him, resulting in his complete financial ruin, maximum wage garnishment, and permanent exile to a minimum wage warehouse job. The silence in the ballroom was absolute electric and charged with sudden realization. The financial sector in New England is an incredibly small, fiercely interconnected community. Everyone in that room knew exactly who I was talking about. Nolan had previously worked for several of the firms represented in the audience, and his sudden unexplained disappearance from the corporate world had been a topic of mild speculation. My speech provided the brutal, undeniable truth. I was publicly dissecting his failure, laying bare his incompetence and criminality for the entire industry to see. I was cementing his reputation as a toxic, radioactive liability. The corporate gossip mill ignited the very second I paused for a sip of water. I could see the high-level executives exchanging knowing, shocked glances. Cell phones were discreetly pulled out under the tables as texts were rapidly fired off to human resources departments and hiring managers across the city. By vaguely referencing his spectacular downfall on such a massive, respected platform, I had effectively blacklisted him forever. The message was unmistakable and irreversible. Any firm that even considered reviewing Nolan's resume would immediately associate him with gross incompetence, malicious fraud, and catastrophic failure. He would never, under any circumstances, hold a director-level position again. His corporate career was completely, permanently dead-buried under the weight of his own well-documented stupidity. I concluded my speech by addressing the fundamental core of wealth management. Protection is not merely about shielding your assets from market volatility. I stated, my voice ringing with absolute unshakable power. True protection is about shielding your legacy from the parasites who smile at you across the dinner table. It is about understanding that your financial independence is your ultimate armor. You must build your legal walls so high and so thick that no one, no matter how charming or persuasive, can ever breach them. Do not apologize for your success. Do not minimize your wealth to make insecure partners feel powerful. Secure your empire ruthlessly, eliminate your liabilities, and never let anyone convince you to surrender the keys to your own kingdom. I stepped back from the podium, letting the silence hold for one perfect suspended second. Then the reaction broke like a massive, unstoppable wave. It started in the front row. Terrence, looking impeccably sharp in a charcoal gray suit, stood up from his reserved seat. His face radiated an expression of absolute profound respect and shared victory. He began to clap, the sound sharp and authoritative in the quiet room. Within 3 seconds, the entire front row had stood up to join him. Within 10 seconds, all 500 executives in the grand ballroom were on their feet, filling the massive space with deafening, thunderous applause. I looked down at Terrence, acknowledging his presence with a knowing nod. We had been targeted and temporarily broken, but we had violently reclaimed our lives. In this single triumphant moment, we were absolutely untouchable. 6 months after the Boston Harbor Hotel keynote speech, the warm golden light of a late summer evening washed over the immaculate brick and timber facade of my Tudor estate. The sweeping circular driveway, once the site of Nolan's humiliating surrender and his family's pathetic eviction, was now lined with luxury vehicles belonging to people who actually mattered. I was finally hosting the grand housewarming party this magnificent property had always deserved. Soft, elegant jazz drifted through the open French doors, blending seamlessly with the melodic clinking of crystal glasses and the genuine, unforced laughter of my guests. There were no rented moving trucks. There were no hostile trespassers attempting to claim what did not belong to them. There was only the absolute, undeniable proof of my complete triumph. I walked through the spacious, meticulously decorated rooms, savoring the profound tranquility that had settled into the bones of the house. The oppressive energy Nolan and his parasitic relatives had brought into my life was completely eradicated. I paused in the doorway of my private home office. The space featured a massive mahogany desk and towering bookshelves filled with financial texts and legal volumes. My eyes deliberately drifted to the far wall. It remained perfectly, beautifully intact. There was no gaping hole leading to an adjacent property. There was no secret doorway constructed to accommodate a demanding, toxic mother-in-law. The wall stood as a solid, impenetrable physical boundary, symbolizing the unbreachable emotional and financial boundaries I had permanently erected around my life. I smiled at the smooth, pristine plaster turned on my heel and glided back toward the lively celebration unfolding in the main hall. The gathering was an exclusive mix of individuals who had supported my journey or respected my professional ascent. My parents stood near the grand marble fireplace, radiating absolute pride. My father was currently boasting to a group of my high-end corporate clients about the brilliant, ruthless efficiency with which I had protected my assets. My mother, holding a flute of imported champagne, caught my eye from across the room and offered a bright, validating smile. They finally understood that my uncompromising boundaries were not a sign of coldness, but a necessary armor against a world filled with opportunistic predators. They had witnessed the absolute destruction Nolan had attempted to orchestrate, and they deeply respected the magnificent fortified empire I had built in the aftermath. I circulated gracefully through the crowd, shaking hands with venture capitalists and managing partners who had attended my seminar. They spoke in hushed, reverent tones about the legendary downfall of my ex-husband, sharing rumors of his new, miserable existence. Nolan was completely blacklisted from the financial sector, effectively exiled forever. He still worked the grueling overnight shift at the logistics warehouse, spending his days trapped inside that moldy, vibrating studio apartment above the laundromat. A massive percentage of his meager warehouse paycheck was immediately intercepted by the state to fulfill the aggressive wage garnishment order, steadily repaying the $250,000 he had stolen from me. He was legally and financially suffocating, buried under the crushing weight of his own calculated greed. His mother, Barbara, remained confined to the bleak senior living facility, permanently stripped of the unearned luxury she had viciously demanded. Their complete ruin was a universal cautionary tale, a permanent stain that ensured they would never manipulate another successful person again. As I approached the outdoor terrace, the evening breeze carried the scent of blooming jasmine from my manicured gardens. Standing near the stone balustrade looking out over the pristine landscape was Terence. He looked remarkably different from the exhausted man who had stood beside me on the porch 6 months ago. He wore a sharply tailored charcoal gray suit that projected success and quiet authority. The dark circles under his eyes had vanished, replaced by the bright focus of a man who had entirely reclaimed his life. Following the swift conclusion of his divorce proceedings, I immediately recruited him. His meticulous documentation of Vanessa's tax fraud had proven his exceptional analytical skills. Terence was now the lead forensic auditor at my rapidly expanding wealth management firm. We were an unstoppable, formidable team specializing in protecting high net worth clients from the exact type of financial predators we had both managed to defeat. I stepped onto the terrace carrying 2 fresh glasses of vintage champagne. I handed one to Terence, who accepted it with a warm, genuine smile. We stood shoulder to shoulder, looking through the open glass doors at the beautiful, vibrant celebration inside my home. We did not need to speak about Vanessa currently working a double shift at the discount clothing outlet, watching her entire paycheck get seized by the Internal Revenue Service to pay off the massive tax burden she had created. We did not need to discuss the miserable, exhausting realities our former spouses were enduring. Their punishments were absolute, self-inflicted, and permanent. To unbreakable boundaries, Terence said quietly, raising his crystal glass toward the starlit sky. And to the empires we build behind them, I replied, my voice ringing with crystalline certainty. The crystal glasses met with a clear, resonant chime that echoed across the quiet terrace. I took a slow sip of the crisp champagne, letting the sweet taste of absolute victory wash over me. I looked around my beautiful, quiet home, completely free of leeches, free of manipulation, and entirely my own. I reached into the pocket of my blazer and pulled out the old spare set of house keys Nolan had once possessed. I walked calmly over to the heavy iron trash receptacle near the edge of the patio and held the metal keys over the dark opening. I opened my fingers, listening to the satisfying metallic clatter as they hit the bottom of the bin. I smiled, turning my face toward the warm evening light, completely untouched